It happened so fast, so brutally, that even now part of me wonders if it was real. 1 minute, I was sipping a glass of sparkling water near the entrance of the wedding venue. The next, I was bleeding on the floor, hit in the head by a metal cake stand swung by my own father. There was no warning, no build-up, just a twisted smile from my mother, a glance from my father, and then violence. All because I said no. No to giving away the home I worked my whole life to build. No to being invisible one more time. My name is Rachel Monroe, and I'm 30 years old. I'm a scientist, a homeowner, a woman who clawed her way out of a family that never saw her until they needed something. What they wanted was my house. What they brought was betrayal. That wedding was supposed to be about my little sister Melissa. But when they pulled me aside with their sugary voices and fake smiles, I knew something was wrong. Rachel, sweetheart, you live alone in that big house. Melissa and Caleb could really use a fresh start, my mother cooed. My heart sank. I didn't even get a chance to answer before my father stepped forward with that awful smirk. We think it'd be the perfect wedding gift, he said. I said no. And then he hit me, right there at the reception hall under the soft glow of fairy lights, in front of dozens of guests and 1,000 tiny lies. My father chose to strike me with cold metal, rather than hear me speak the word no. I remember the sting, the shock, the silence right after. Blood on white tile, gasps, phones raised, the music stopped, and the last thing I saw before the paramedics came was Melissa standing frozen in her gown, as everything she believed about our perfect family shattered around her. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, should have felt like sunlight on skin-warm, familiar, safe. But in our 2-story colonial home with blue shutters and a swing on the porch, it always felt like I was living in someone else's story, one where I had no lines, no spotlight, and no applause. From the moment Melissa was born, it was like the gravity in our house shifted. Everything orbited around her. She had that curly blonde hair, that sing-song voice, those perfectly timed giggles that made strangers stop and smile. My mother Eleanor adored her, called her my little angel, even when she broke things or lied. My father, Richard, acted like she was some tiny prodigy sent to make his life matter. And me, I was just Rachel, the quiet one, the serious one, the one who read too much and smiled too little. I remember my 5th birthday better than I wish I did. I had begged for a kid's chemistry set. I wanted to mix colors, create reactions, feel like the world made sense through glass tubes and bubbling beakers. Instead, I opened a box wrapped in pink ribbon and pulled out a frilly dress, lacy and loud and everything I wasn't. "Oh, Rachel," my mom squealed. "Now you'll look just as pretty as Melissa." I looked up, hoping for even a hint of recognition, that I was disappointed that it wasn't what I wanted. But her eyes were already on Melissa, who was twirling beside me in a matching dress. I never wore that thing, not once. That was the pattern. Melissa would win a spelling bee. There'd be balloons. I'd win a statewide science fair. Dad would mutter, "Good job, kiddo," then ask me to take out the trash. At first, I tried harder. I thought maybe if I won more, shined brighter, stayed quieter, they'd notice me. Middle school came and went with straight A's. I taught myself basic coding, built a weather balloon from scratch, even placed in the state's Young Innovators competition. They never showed up to the ceremony. Later that week, they posted photos of Melissa's tap dance showcase all over the fridge. She placed 4th, but she was adorable. I was just too intense. It hurt in ways I couldn't describe then, but I know now. It's the kind of hurt that teaches you to shrink. I learned to exist without taking up space. I became excellent at blending in. Never asking, never demanding, never dreaming out loud. I buried myself in school, in books, in quiet. The only place I ever felt seen was in the lab. My high school chemistry teacher, Mrs. Landers, once pulled me aside and said, "Rachel, you don't just understand science. It lives in you. You should think about applying to universities with real research programs." It was the first time an adult ever spoke to me like I mattered. At home, though, nothing changed. Eleanor still called Melissa her miracle. Richard still laughed louder at her jokes than he ever had at mine. Holidays were performances Melissa in front me behind the curtain. Even at family dinners, if I offered an idea, Mom would say, "Rachel, not now." But when Melissa chimed in with something nearly identical 5 minutes later, Mom would beam like she'd just solved world hunger. By the time I was 16, I knew this wasn't something that would fix itself. They didn't forget me by accident. They forgot me because they were only interested in the version of me that made them look good. A girl in a lab coat that didn't photograph well. A girl who wore sneakers instead of heels. Not impressive at garden parties. A girl who asked too many questions, who refused to smile when she didn't feel it. That was inconvenient, but still, I didn't rebel. I didn't scream or slam doors or threaten to run away. Instead, I made a promise to myself quietly in the dark of my room where no one ever knocked. One day I would leave, not to escape them, but to find myself. I wouldn't become what they wanted. I'd become what I needed. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally feel like I belonged to something real. College wasn't just an escape, it was my lifeline. When I got my acceptance letter from the University of Georgia, full scholarship in environmental biochemistry, I read it 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. I held the envelope in my trembling hands and stood silently in the kitchen while Eleanor sliced apples and Richard read the sports section. I got in, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor didn't look up. "That's nice, honey," she replied, "but it's a long way from home, don't you think?" Richard finally glanced over his glasses. "What about Clemson?" "It's closer. You could come home on weekends, help out with Melissa's pageants." I didn't answer. I packed my bags in silence. No party, no family dinner. Melissa barely looked up from her phone as I rolled my suitcase down the hall. My mother handed me a Tupperware of leftover lasagna and said, "Don't forget men like women who can cook." My father grunted something like "good luck," then went back to the game. I didn't cry when I left. I didn't feel angry. I felt empty, like the house had already forgotten me. But the moment I stepped onto campus, something changed. I could breathe. I didn't have to apologize for taking up space. I didn't have to pretend. In lecture halls filled with sharp minds and cluttered notebooks, I felt alive. In labs that smelled of acetone and glass, I felt grounded. I wore jeans and hoodies and didn't brush my hair every day. No one cared. They listened when I spoke. They asked me for help. I was finally visible, while other students stumbled home from parties at 3 a.m. I stayed late in the research center running soil samples and optimizing enzyme chains. I wasn't just learning, I was building a future. My professors noticed I got selected for an undergrad fellowship during my sophomore year, then a summer placement with a sustainability think tank. I wrote 2 co-authored papers before I was 21. I didn't chase approval anymore, I chased impact. Every dollar I made from tutoring, from fellowships, from lab assistants, I saved. I didn't buy new clothes, I didn't eat out. My roommates joked I lived like a monk, but I had a plan. Because freedom for someone like me isn't free. It costs energy, years, discipline. By graduation, I already had a job offer biotech research associate at a private lab in Savannah. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. And it was mine. Savannah felt like a new start. The city had that dreamy, moss-covered charm. But beneath it, a steady hum of ambition. I moved into a studio apartment on the east side, ate cereal for dinner most nights, and worked 10-hour days without complaint. I poured everything into that job. I published, collaborated, even spoke at a small science symposium in Atlanta. And after 4 years of climbing the ladder, of skipping vacations, of taking every overtime shift I could, I did something no one in my family thought I'd ever do. I bought a house, not a mansion, not a fixer-upper. A 2-bedroom craftsman with white shutters, a deep porch, and a backyard filled with sunflowers and promise. It cost $460,000. I put down $80,000 in cash. No cosigner, no debt, just me. I walked through it on closing day, in complete silence, touching the walls like they were alive. This house wasn't just a roof, it was proof. Proof that I didn't need applause to succeed. Proof that a girl who grew up ignored and overlooked could plant herself into something solid and bloom. I painted the front door sage green, hung shelves for all my books, grew tomatoes and lavender in the backyard. I drank coffee barefoot on the porch and listened to the birds instead of voices that tore me down. It was the first place that ever felt like it belonged to me. When I called Eleanor to tell her, she said, "That's a lot of space for just one person, don't you think?" She didn't ask for pictures. Richard said, "Just make sure the roof doesn't leak," and changed the subject to Melissa's latest pageant win. But for the first time, their silence didn't break me. It strengthened me. I didn't buy that house to show off. I bought it to survive, to breathe, to finally stop waiting for someone else to give me permission to feel proud. And I swore to myself, no matter what happened, I would never ever give it up. Not for anyone, not for blood, not for obligation. It was more than a home. It was the life I built with my own hands. And no one, no matter how sweet their smile or how sharp their words, had the right to take it from me. Melissa's wedding was the event of the year, at least. That's how Eleanor described it to anyone who'd listen. It was held at the Magnolia Manor, just outside Charleston. One of those white-columned southern estates dripping in Spanish moss and fake sentiment. There were gold accents on every table, strings of fairy lights glowing like stars, and over 200 guests dressed like they were attending a royal ball. Not the wedding of a 24-year-old influencer and her real estate fiancé. I showed up wearing a navy blue dress I'd worn to conferences. Plain, practical, wrinkle-resistant. I brought a gift wrapped in silver paper, a custom-engraved compass locket symbolizing new journeys and direction. I even offered to help set up the seating chart when I arrived early. No one noticed. Eleanor floated past me in her crystal-embellished gown, directing vendors and scolding servers. Richard stood near the fireplace, hands clasped, beaming like he'd just secured a merger. Melissa sparkled literally in a hand-beaded gown that probably cost more than my car. She flitted from person to person, hugging, air-kissing, laughing like she'd swallowed a spotlight. I stayed on the fringes, smiling politely, answering questions when asked, nodding through conversations about flowers and seating, and which hashtag Melissa's wedding photos should use. I didn't expect fanfare. I didn't even expect a thank you, but I didn't expect what came next either. Just before the ceremony was set to begin, Eleanor found me near the hors d'oeuvres table, holding a glass of sparkling water and pretending I wasn't invisible. She walked over with a smile so sweet it could curdle cream. "Rachel, darling," she said, placing a manicured hand on my arm. "Come with us for a quick word." Richard joined us a moment later. His posture was stiff, formal, calculated. My stomach turned before a single word left their mouths. They led me past the crowd, through the side hallway of the venue, and into a quiet, candlelit room that smelled like roses and old money. Eleanor didn't waste time. "This day is so important for your sister," she began, voice soft but tight. "And everything's been perfect so far. But there's just one thing we need your help with." I stared at her, then at Richard. He cleared his throat. "It's about your house," he said. My chest tightened. "What about it?" Eleanor leaned in, her eyes gleaming not with pride, but with expectation. "Melissa and Caleb are going to start their lives together, and well, with the housing market right now. Wouldn't it be such a beautiful gesture if you gave them your home as a wedding gift?" I blinked, once, twice. "Something." "You're serious," I said, my voice flat. Of course she beamed like this was some magical solution. "You live alone. That space is too big for just one person. And this would mean so much to your sister." "It's your duty as family," Richard interrupted. "Duty?" That word dropped like a hammer in my chest. They weren't asking, they were presenting. I took a breath, slow and steady, but inside my ribs, a fire had already caught. "That house," I said carefully, "took me 6 years to afford. I worked 2 jobs, I skipped vacations, I missed birthdays and holidays just to save enough. That's my home." Richard shrugged. "So buy another." "You act like it's a sweater," I snapped, voice rising. "Do you have any idea what that place means to me?" Eleanor's face shifted, sweetness evaporated. Her lips pinched into a sharp line. "I thought you'd be generous," she hissed. "Melissa deserves a fresh start, and I deserve to keep what I built." Her eyes narrowed. "You always were selfish." That word selfish lit the fuse. I straightened. My heart was thudding now, every beat louder than the last. "I'm not giving them my house," I said firmly. "This conversation is over." But Richard didn't let it end. In a blur, he turned fast, too fast, and reached for the cake stand that had been sitting on the dessert table beside us. A heavy, decorative silver base meant to hold the couple's engagement cake. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just swung. The metal hit the side of my head with a crack that echoed in my skull. White-hot pain bloomed instantly. My knees buckled. I stumbled back, one hand flying to the spot above my ear, already wet with blood. Time warped. The music in the distance stopped. A scream cut through the air. Glass shattered somewhere. I could barely hear over the rush in my ears, but I saw it, dozens of guests turning phones, raised mouths open in shock. I saw Melissa standing in the doorway, her veil trailing behind her like smoke. She didn't run to me. She just stood there, mouth open, eyes wide, as if she couldn't decide who the real victim was. "You selfish girl!" Eleanor shouted, lunging toward me. Her voice was venom. Her face twisted with fury. "After everything we've done for you, how dare you ruin her day?" I staggered. Someone tried to catch me. I don't remember who. Then a voice, sharp, unfamiliar, rang out above the chaos. "I'm calling the police." It was a guest. Eric, I think, Caleb's cousin. Eleanor screamed again, but someone pulled her back. Another guest stepped between us. More phones came up. Flashlights, voices, confusion. And then sirens, loud, close. Vase. The red and blue reflections danced across the venue's glass windows as paramedics burst in. I was on the ground now, still clutching my head. Blood stained my dress. My vision swam. Somewhere behind all the noise and panic, I heard Caleb shouting at Melissa. "You let this happen," he yelled. I couldn't see her response, but I saw the look on his face, like something he believed in had just shattered. As the paramedics lifted me onto the stretcher and guided me through the crowd, I saw Eleanor in handcuffs. Richard, too. They weren't yelling now. They were stunned, cornered, small. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one disappearing into the background. They were. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow thud, sealing out the chaos behind me. Inside, the sirens wailed, but I barely heard them. Everything was muffled, distant. The throbbing in my skull drowned out the noise, pulsing like a second heartbeat. I stared at the ceiling of the ambulance, my bloodied hand gripping the side rail, as the paramedics worked quickly gauze vitals questions I couldn't quite process. My vision blurred and cleared in waves. "She's stable," one of them said. "Let's keep her awake just in case." I nodded faintly, more out of instinct than understanding. I didn't feel awake. I felt untethered, like I'd left my body back in that reception hall. Somewhere between the flashing lights and antiseptic smell, I heard the faint buzz of a phone ringing. Then a voice, soft, shaky. "I recorded it," a woman said. "The whole thing. She didn't do anything wrong. I didn't know who she was. Maybe a guest, maybe someone's plus one." But in that moment, she felt like the only person in the world who'd seen me. By the time we reached the hospital, the video had already started to spread. Not to the public yet, but among guests, between phones, from hand to hand like whispered truth. And the truth was ugly. Richard had hit me, not pushed, not yelled, not lost his temper in a vague, excusable way. He had lifted a metal cake stand full force and swung it at his own daughter because she said no. And someone had caught every second of it, in perfect clarity. No room for doubt, no context to twist. Inside the emergency room, while nurses cleaned the blood from my temple and stitched the gash above my ear, a police officer came in to take my statement. His expression was tense but kind, professional but disturbed. "We have multiple eyewitness accounts," he said, "and 3 video recordings. You don't need to say much now, but we will need a formal statement once you're stable." I managed a small nod. The officer glanced toward the hallway. "They're being processed. Assault and battery with a weapon. Possibly coercion of property, depending on the final report." Coercion of property. That's what this boiled down to for them. Legal terminology, a box on a form. But to me, it was everything. It was my childhood, my silence, my sacrifices, all leading to that one moment of defiance, one no that finally tore the curtain down. By the next morning, the hospital was flooded with flower deliveries and messages from people I barely knew. Caleb's parents sent a long handwritten note. His mother wrote, "I'm so sorry we didn't see it sooner. No one should have to fight this hard just to be respected." And Melissa, she didn't reach out, not a call, not a text, nothing. Later that afternoon, a nurse wheeled in, a small bouquet of daisies, simple, fresh, and unfamiliar. Attached was a card. "You were right. They don't get to own your life, Caleb." I stared at the note for a long time. The man who was supposed to marry my sister had watched her family implode in real time, and instead of denying it, he acknowledged it. The next time I saw him, he was standing in the hospital hallway, hands in his pockets, looking like someone who had aged 10 years in 24 hours. "I'm not here to make this worse," he said as he sat beside my bed. I didn't say anything. He let out a slow breath. "I ended it with Melissa. I can't build a life with someone who stands still when their sister bleeds." Those words hit me harder than the swing ever did. He wasn't there for romance. He wasn't there for sympathy. He was there to say, "You're not crazy." I saw it too. By the end of the week, I had retained a lawyer, a close friend of Caleb's named Dr. Lewis. He reviewed the footage, the medical report, the witness statements, and looked me in the eye. "You have a solid case, stronger than most we see." Still, I hesitated. I didn't want revenge, but I wanted the truth, documented, named, faced, and more than anything, I wanted to make sure they couldn't do it again. So I nodded, "Let's do it." And just like that, we began the process of taking my parents to court. Not out of spite, but for survival, because the video hadn't just captured a crime. It had captured a moment when I stopped being afraid and finally started to fight back. The courtroom smelled like cold air and paper, polished wood, dust and tension. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer and low heels, my hands folded so tightly my knuckles ached. Dr. Lewis, calm as ever, sat beside me thumbing through documents with surgical precision. Behind us, the gallery was packed. Friends, colleagues, former classmates, even strangers who had seen the video online. A few reporters too, their pens ready, eyes sharp. Across the aisle sat Eleanor and Richard, my parents. Eleanor wore a pearl gray suit and a smile so tight it looked stapled to her face. Richard looked older than I remembered, hollow, like the pride had been scraped out of him. Neither of them would look at me. They whispered with their attorney, a man who clearly thought this was just another civil case. Another angry daughter with a grudge and a lawyer. But this wasn't a grudge. This was war. Judge Benton, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, entered with a bang of her gavel and a glance that said she'd seen far worse but wasn't going to tolerate even a whisper of drama. Her presence snapped the room into stillness. The trial began. Dr. Lewis started with the basics. My education, my job, the house, how I bought it, what it meant to me. He presented the deed, the financial records, the timeline. Then came the shift. He introduced the video. The courtroom lights dimmed just slightly as the screen was pulled down. And then, there it was. The reception hall, the silver cake stand, Richard's arms swinging in a fast, brutal arc. My body staggering back, blood, chaos. Eleanor lunging forward, mouth open, her voice. "You selfish girl," clear and sharp. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. People didn't look at me. They stared at the screen as if trying to process how something so intimate could be so violent, so public. When the footage ended, silence swallowed the room. Then Dr. Lewis called the witnesses. Eric was first. His voice was steady. He described the scene. The noise, the panic. He said it wasn't an accident. It wasn't heat of the moment. It was calculated. She said no, and they punished her. More guests followed. Women, men, even a florist who'd been arranging the dessert table nearby. They all told the same story. Rachel said no, and her parents snapped. Then came the testimonies that dug even deeper. Dr. Lewis called a former teacher of mine, Ms. Landers. She described how I was often forgotten at school events. She'd sit there alone every award night. I stopped expecting to see her parents. Another witness, my college roommate, spoke about the late nights I spent working to save money. How I'd cry quietly some weekends because I couldn't afford to fly home, only to realize no one had asked me to. Each story built on the last. Not just one night, not just one blow, but a pattern, a legacy, a lifetime of silence, erasure, and sacrifice. The defense tried to push back. Their lawyer painted me as emotionally distant, uncommunicative, even bitter. He claimed the house conversation was a miscommunication, a well-intended suggestion misunderstood in a high-pressure moment. Richard never spoke. Eleanor took the stand briefly. She cried, told the court she only wanted to help her daughters become closer. She said Rachel always kept her distance. We just wanted her to feel like part of the family again. When Dr. Lewis cross-examined her, he held up photos of Melissa's birthday parties, graduation banners, and social media posts praising her beauty, her grace, her achievements. Then he held up my state science fair certificate, creased, faded, forgotten, in the background of an old photo. Can you explain why this wasn't celebrated the same way, he asked. Eleanor's eyes darted. Her mouth opened, closed. Nothing came out. In closing, Dr. Lewis stood tall and calm. This is not about family tension. This is not about a misunderstanding. This is about coercion, about punishment, about a grown woman being physically attacked and emotionally manipulated because she dared to set a boundary. He let the silence sit. And it's about finally drawing a line in the sand and saying no more. The jury deliberated for only 90 minutes. When they returned, their faces were pale and grim. The foreperson stood, eyes scanning the paper in his hands. We, the jury, find the defendants, Eleanor Monroe and Richard Monroe, guilty on all counts: felony assault, attempted coercion of property, and emotional abuse. The gavel hit the wood like a thunderclap. Eleanor gasped, grabbing the edge of the table. Richard sat motionless, his face drained of color. Judge Benton didn't hesitate. In light of the overwhelming evidence and the calculated nature of the attack, she said, her voice like steel, "This court sentences each defendant to 6 years in state prison with no eligibility for parole before serving 4. She paused. Additionally, the defendants are ordered to pay full restitution to the plaintiff for medical expenses, legal fees, and emotional damages. I exhaled, shaky raw. For the first time, the weight I'd carried since I was 5 years old began to lift. As Eleanor and Richard were handcuffed and led out, Richard turned to glance at me just once. His eyes searched mine for something. Regret, maybe, or forgiveness, but I gave him nothing, because you can't forgive someone who refuses to admit they broke you. The courtroom emptied slowly. People whispered, hugged, stared. Caleb stood in the back, arms crossed, nodding slightly. Not smiling, but steady, proud. Dr. Lewis turned to me and said, "You did something most people never have the courage to do." I didn't feel brave. I felt free, and that was enough. It was a week after the sentencing when Melissa showed up. I was back home, my home, curled on the porch with a cup of tea, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the yard. The house was quiet, peaceful, mine again in every way that mattered. When the knock came, I almost didn't get up, but something in my gut told me who it was before I even opened the door. Melissa stood there in jeans and a gray sweatshirt. No makeup, her hair tied up in a messy bun. She looked smaller than I remembered, less camera-ready, more human. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but not from crying now. From crying a lot before. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away, just stepped aside. She walked in slowly, like the walls might reject her. Her eyes scanned the room, the bookshelf I built, the plants on the windowsill, the same sage-green door she once dismissed as too earthy. "It's nice," she murmured. I sat down across from her, but didn't offer tea. I wasn't ready for that. She wrung her hands in her lap. "I didn't know it would go that far." I didn't say anything. I mean, Mom always pushed, but I thought she'd guilt you. Not that. I stared at her, letting the silence hang. Her words landed like pebbles on stone. She leaned forward. "Rachel, I didn't ask them to do that. I didn't want the house like that. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "Didn't you?" I asked quietly. Her face twisted. "I wanted a gift, not a hostage situation." I flinched. Melissa sighed, sinking deeper into the chair. "You don't understand. Being the favorite sounds great until you realize it's conditional. I had to perform always. Had to smile, had to win, had to look perfect. I looked her in the eye, and I had to disappear. She winced. I was the act she admitted. You were the backbone. And I never said thank you for that. A long pause settled between us. Heavy, honest. Then she whispered, I know you hate me, but I came here because I still see you as my sister. I swallowed hard. Do you see me now? Or do you just see what you lost? She blinked. You didn't protect me, I said. You stood there and watched it happen. And the worst part, you believed them when they said I owed you. Her lips trembled. I was scared. So was I. For 30 years. She broke, then tears spilling, hands shaking. I don't want to lose you. I stood up slowly, walking to the window, looking out at the yard I'd poured my soul into. I think you already did, I said gently. At least the version of me that stayed quiet to keep the peace. She stood too, wiping her face. So that's it, I turned. I don't hate you, but I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. She nodded barely. At the door, she hesitated. Will you ever forgive me? I took a breath. Maybe, but forgiveness isn't the same as reunion. Her eyes filled again. She stepped out without another word, and I watched her walk down the steps through the garden and back into whatever story she now had to rewrite without me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cold. I felt resolute, because loving someone doesn't mean letting them back in. Sometimes love is setting the boundary and holding it. Spring in Savannah smells like jasmine and salt. The days got longer, the nights quieter, and little by little life started to feel like mine again. Not borrowed, not bargained for, just mine. The stitches came out, the bruises faded, but the shift inside me, the part that finally stopped apologizing, stuck. I repainted the living room in soft honey tones, bought a second-hand record player, and filled the house with Ella Fitzgerald and Sam Cooke. I even started planting vegetables in the backyard, messy rows of tomatoes, peppers, rosemary. Every time I pushed my hands into the dirt, I reminded myself I was building something no one could take. One morning, I stood in front of the deed framed above my desk. My name alone bold and unchallenged. Rachel Monroe, a name that had once felt like an afterthought, now it was a statement. A declaration. The house was quiet, but never empty. I had people now. Not blood, not obligation, chosen people. My lab partner dropped off sourdough once a week. My elderly neighbor brought me fresh herbs from her garden. I tutored a high school girl named Alyssa every Tuesday, bright, angry, brilliant. She reminded me of myself at 15, full of potential, but starving for someone to see it. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. That boundaries are power. That silence isn't noble when it costs your dignity. That you don't owe anyone your peace, especially not people who demand it as payment. Some evenings I'd sit on the back steps, knees pulled up to my chest, gills, watching the sun dip behind the fence. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclaps, just golden light filtering through the trees. And for the first time in my life, I felt safe in stillness. Then one Sunday, I got a knock at the door. Caleb. He held 2 cups of coffee and a crooked smile. Before you shut the door in my face, this one's black with oat milk. Just like you hate it. I let out a laugh I didn't know I'd been holding. You remembered, he shrugged. It's my one party trick. We sat on the porch, knees almost touching, not quite. We didn't talk about Melissa, or the trial, or the chaos. We talked about jazz and houseplants and the weird smell in his new apartment. He came back the next week, and the one after that. Not with promises, not with big speeches, just presence. It wasn't romantic, not at first. It was respect, a soft rhythm between two people who'd seen the worst in others and refused to let it shape them. Eventually, I invited him to help me paint the guest room. He spilled a full can on the floor and laughed like it was the best thing that had happened all week. One night, as we stood on the porch, watching fireflies blink between the trees, he reached for my hand, just held it. No pressure, no expectation. I never saw a woman fight for herself like that. He said, "I didn't know it was possible." I squeezed his fingers gently. I didn't either, until I did. There was no big moment, no movie scene kiss in the rain, just quiet, ease, the kind of peace that comes after a storm you thought would swallow you whole but didn't. And eventually we stopped saying my house or your place. It just became home. Because it wasn't about walls or paperwork or square footage. It was about the life we were choosing to build inside it. And every door we closed behind us was another chapter sealed, another ghost let go. Every night I laid my head on the pillow. I reminded myself, this is what happens when you choose yourself. When you protect what you've earned. When you stop shrinking to make room for people who refuse to see you. This wasn't just a new chapter, it was a whole new book. People think family is supposed to be unconditional. That blood means loyalty, that history means obligation, that if someone raised you, you owe them access to your future, no matter what they did to your past. But I've learned something different. You don't owe anyone the parts of yourself you had to build from scratch. Not if they tried to tear you down first. You don't owe anyone your peace just because you share a last name. I spent most of my life trying to earn love from people who only offered it when I made them look good. I worked harder, got quieter, became smaller, just hoping they'd notice. They didn't. But here's the thing, being unseen by them didn't mean I was unworthy. It meant they weren't capable of seeing past their own reflection. And when I stopped bending myself into shapes, they'd recognize they called me selfish, cold, ungrateful. But it wasn't selfish to say no. It was survival. I learned that home isn't a house. It's not square footage or granite countertops. Home is a boundary you guard. It's the place where your voice matters, where your safety isn't negotiable, where you get to exist without editing yourself for someone else's comfort. And if someone asks you to give up that kind of space for guilt for appearances for what family does, you're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to lock the door behind you. Forgiveness is powerful, but it's not an invitation. Closure is healing, but it doesn't require a reunion. Some people will never apologize. Some will rewrite this story to make themselves the victim. Some will show up at your door crying, not because they regret hurting you, but because they miss controlling you. Let them cry. Let them grieve the version of you that tolerated it. You don't have to go back just because they finally noticed you're gone. The life I have now, it's not loud, it's not flashy, but it's mine. Every decision, every morning routine, every square inch of quiet I earned. And if there's one lesson I'll never forget, it's this. You don't wait for permission to protect yourself. You don't need consensus to reclaim your worth. And no matter where you come from, no matter how broken the story that made you, you can still choose to write your own ending. One where love is real, respect is non-negotiable, and home is finally safe. The courthouse steps had been silent the day I walked out, verdict in hand, freedom finally mine. But months later, on those very same steps, I stood again. This time in a soft ivory dress, no veil, no crowd. Just me, Caleb, and a small circle of people who had shown up not out of obligation, but because they chose to. The sun was warm, the breeze carried laughter and magnolia petals through the air. Caleb looked at me like I was the only thing that ever made sense. And when he held my hand and whispered his vows, he didn't talk about forever like it was some dreamy idea. He talked about earning it. He promised honesty, quiet support, space to be exactly who I am. I didn't cry until the moment we signed the license, and he looked up with a soft grin. "I guess we both changed our names today," he said. I laughed through tears, because it was true. Not just legally, but in every way that matters. We moved into the house not because I had to share it, but because I wanted to. We planted a new garden, painted the fence, cooked together, argued over cabinet organization, built a life that wasn't perfect but was real. And every time someone asks if we plan to have a family, I say this: we already do, because family isn't something you're born into. It's something you build, through choice, through boundaries, through love that doesn't require you to bleed for it first. I look around now, and I see a life I shaped from ruin brick by brick, breath by breath. I didn't just survive. I created something stronger. And when I go to sleep at night with the windows open and his arm wrapped around me, I don't feel like the invisible girl anymore. I feel like a woman who took everything meant to break her and used it to build something unshakable. A home, a life, a name I'm finally proud to live in.